Avengers! Assemble.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Excelsior, the world's #1 Marvel's Avengers podcast. I'm your director, Christian Buckley. As always, joining me is the Apex legend, Jack Martin.
Excelsior, Christian. Hey, we can finally use that term more accurately now that you and I, along with Mike Connors, played some Apex last night. Now, did we become Apex legends? I'll keep that to ourselves. But we certainly played the game.
We sure did. We sure moved around on those maps.
Shaking the rest up.
Yeah. As you would, as Marvel has with Phase 4 for some characters, you would say.
Mm-hmm.
So, for listeners, you're listening to this at the normal episode time. However, it is being recorded much earlier than usual due to scheduling stuff, and I'll remind, next week, no episode. Week after, double dose of She-Hulk episodes. We're going to be talking all about that when we return. I think that next episode is coming out, let me look at calendar. August 27th is the next time you're going to be hearing from us, barring any emergencies. But yeah, things did not shake out to get this week's War Table blog, so no Avengers news this week on the #1 Marvel's Avengers podcast. Sorry about that. Guess what? Iron Man in his swim trunks is probably in the shop this week.
I was going to say, it's funny because I fully expect no significant news, but wouldn't it be just hilarious if there's a giant news drop now during the time where we are basically like 2 weeks away, 2 weeks off of Avengers, the game itself.
Mm-hmm.
That would just be hilarious.
I'll say this. At this moment in time, if something does happen, I'll record a solo, 10-minute recap. I'll splice it in here for the episode. So I'm giving myself a clean entry point.
Or just clear disappointment.
Yeah, exactly. Or nothing happened. But we got some headlines to discuss this week. There are some things before we get to our main topic, which is reviewing the second half of Spider-Man Life Story. But before we get into any of that, Jack, you doing all right? How you doing? How you feeling in the world of Marvel right now?
Doing good. In the world of Marvel, pretty barren. Aside from the comic that we'll get into, haven't really been doing too much Marvel stuff. Mm-hmm. Been playing a lot of Resident Evil 2. Let me tell you what, that game's amazing. Love it a lot. Started a second playthrough. One of the few games where I was like, yep, starting that again.
Hell yeah.
So that was great. But yeah, how about you?
Pretty good. Yeah, nothing Marvel lately in addition to what we typically cover for the show and do for the show every week. But yeah, in my game time, start up a fresh playthrough of Red Dead 2.
Ooh, yes.
That is one of my favorite games of all time. That was already... I for the longest time, I'm still trying to figure out my top 10. I've been trying to figure it out for years. But one thing I always knew was that the original Red Dead Redemption was my second favorite game of all time. And then when I played Red Dead 2, I was like, oh, just replace that with Red Dead 2. And then I cast the OG Red Dead to wherever it would end up in my favorites of all time list. But obviously I played things like Resident Evil 2, like Marvel's Avengers, I'm kidding, that have cracked the top 5 and bumped Red Dead down. But I'm excited to revisit it without the noise and without people being like, oh, I don't like how the aiming works.
Yeah.
It's never been good. If you want good aiming, play first person shooter. That's what I have to say about it, Jeff.
No, it's a good call. That's a good point. Red Dead, the original Red Dead, I was with you, was in my top 10 for a while. And then things like Apex Legends came around and Metal Gear Solid and things like that came to bump it down. But Red Dead 1 and Red Dead 2, I do a thing with my top 50 list where if I like a game enough, 2 games enough, I just put them in the same slot. So Red Dead and Red Dead 2 are the 11th slot for me right now. And I could go, you could ask me one day or another, which one do I prefer? And I would say either one, depending on the day. They're just that good.
It's a smart way to do it, Jack. I think that's a good plan. And the plan for this podcast this week is shrinking down Ant-Man style, because we got a new segment, Pym particle headlines. What does this mean? I don't know. I thought it was going to be a short show, so I wanted something fun. It's small.
We should keep this like little updates.
Yeah, I'm into
I
it.
like that. Yeah.
Look forward to it next time we get on here when we have what if Marvel's Avengers just ends up taking over the Pym particle segment.
Yep.
A few things. Firstly, something leaked. We are not going to discuss it in entire details, but if you're fully sensitive to spoilers about Ironheart production, maybe skip ahead, let's say 5 minutes. Okay, that was your chance. Set photos have leaked. Within hours of people posting about how there's like reflective umbrellas, so to avoid set photos, like that was probably a dare. Like the paparazzi saw that and they were like, "All right, bet." And then within hours of that initial thing, there was set photos of the Ironheart suit. That's right. It's a practical on-set get-up. At least this first version is. You had some great descriptors, Jack, of what it looks like before we start recording. You want to describe it?
Yes. So there's like a couple images. One of them is the actress, I'm forgetting her name, in the Ironheart like top and like the CG like suit below her. But the second one is like the full suit. And this is Dominique Thorne is her name. But the full suit, I think, looks like a combination of Samus from Metroid. My first instinct was Brotherhood of Steel from Fallout, but then you also get like Halo vibes and Doom vibes as well. So, yeah, it looks like similar to Mark 1 in a sense of Iron Man, but it's really, I think, a combination of all those things. And it looks pretty different from what we've seen in the MCU so far. And yeah, it looks really cool.
You know what it reminded me of? What like within the MCU is the War Machine look from Endgame, where like the bulkiness is there in certain spots, but it does look very sleek, right? I'm thinking of War Machine's look. It kind of reminds me of like Mega Man, where it's like yeah, his torso is like looks like an Iron Man torso, and then like the feet are big and the fists are big, but like the appendages to get there are sort of like tapered in a way.
Right.
It looks similar to this, I think. And we were speculating that in the Wakanda Forever trailer, we see her crafting a suit. So if this is the 1.0 suit or not, presumably this suit will be used to whatever degree Riri Williams is at play in Wakanda Forever. Maybe she's just a cameo and she's building the suit, and then this suit is the first one she uses in the show. But I think the story here is that on set they're using a practical suit again, which is something they did for Iron Man for a long time, right? I think for like the first two phases at least, you'd see pictures of Robert Downey Jr. with like the I don't know, like the plexiglass torso, arms, and helmet thing, and then the pajama pants, right? So I think that's cool. I think that's a nice touch, and I think in the past that did a lot for the believability of the movement of the suit. Obviously, the CG artists are great, and they do what they do best to make it look lifelike, but I do think there is something of having... It's like Jurassic Park. Like, if you have part of the element there, it's still going to look better than if it's just nothing.
Yeah, totally. Wonder how long that will stay, though.
Yeah, I would imagine not very long. Similar to Iron Man, maybe an abridged version of that for
Right.
maybe within this show. I think maybe we'll get a practical version of the final suit, and then moving forward, maybe just the ping pong balls.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other thoughts on the Ironheart suit? Do you like it?
Yeah, I think I do like it. It's one of those things where usually you see the set photo and it's like, oh, that doesn't look great. But then when the show or movie comes out, it's like, oh, that actually ended up being okay. This, I think, looks good from like a weird set photo perspective, but I'm even more like interested to see what it actually looks like in action. So like off to a great start, I think.
Hell yeah. Moving on, speaking of hell, the devil's back, Jack.
Ooh.
Daredevil.
Born again.
He has been born again. Uh, oh Lord. The I don't know if this was official or not, but like the visual quality of this is too high to feel like a leak. But I didn't see. This might have been like in the teaser or something. I'm not sure. Do you know the source of this?
I think this was in like one of the new teasers.
Okay. So we have an official look at Matt Murdock, Daredevil, in the She-Hulk series. We get to see a great look, presumably from that same shot of that reveal tease where he jumps off the parking garage and lands. Looks like the next frame of that shot where we see him, he's looking over his shoulder in a nice crimson and yellow suit.
Yeah, this is really different than what
Very
he was like completely either wearing all black or wearing like the very dark red / maroon. So yeah, this is inspired by was it the Born Again comic series or Daredevil Yellow? I actually don't know.
So
Man Without Fear.
Daredevil Yellow was similar to Spider-Man Blue, like let's look back at this specific era of this character and like tell a story with it. But yeah, I think the yellow suit was Frank Miller. I'm not entirely sure. I just know it was tied to a specific run of the character. It wasn't permanent. I think maybe early Daredevil, we had the yellow worked into the suit, but yeah, you're right. It is very different. What is the implication of this? Is this them trying to distance themselves from the Netflix version? Is this trying to establish and set expectations that it's not the same Daredevil? Or is this just the same Daredevil we all know and love, same Matt Murdock? Want to switch it up a little bit after a while. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think that's what it is, and it's cool. I don't foresee this being his new standard costume, but I mean it's the MCU. You gotta throw in a new costume every once in a while. So this is our alternate jersey for Daredevil, and we can enjoy it for She-Hulk. And then I imagine he'll get a new. Man, that's what I'm really excited for. Like, what's his like capital M MCU suit gonna look like in his TV show?
Yeah, I could see a world where because we know Daredevil's going to be popping up in so many projects for the next, well, 2 years before we get the show. That's a 2024 project, right?
Yeah, 2024.
Like he's going to show up in Echo, he's going to be in She-Hulk. I wouldn't put it past them to have him pop up in some other places. I could see a world where, similar to what you're saying, like this is his, you know, his distinct new look, new exciting fun, and then when we get Born Again, because of the title, maybe we do go through like a rebirth, a rebaptism almost of him getting back in red and maybe getting the most iconic look, right? I remember there was talk from like a Charlie Cox interview sometime last year where he said he always looked at the D's on the suit being sort of like a thing that the character and him would have to earn. So if we see Daredevil like in the background of a few projects going through some like mini arc and then in Born Again, like I could maybe see that be where we're going, where we get like the iconic 2Ds on the suit, maybe more closer to a Spider-Man suit than the hockey padded Dark Knight looking Daredevil suits we're used to. I could see it work into his character arc is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So
All for that.
very exciting stuff. And what's more exciting, maybe, depending on who you ask, is the idea of the Punisher, John Bernthal, returning. Rosario Dawson was at some sort of convention recently and said, I'm paraphrasing, I just heard that they're getting John back to be Punisher in the MCU. And the crowd went wild. And then I think a day or two later, she's like, oh, you can't trust anybody, not even me. I heard that from some fan, I guess. So,
Huh. She loves to leak things, doesn't she?
yeah, she does.
She did the. Now it's entirely possible that I mean, I kind of think she said what she said because she probably had insider knowledge, and then her publicist or whoever was probably like, "Hey, don't say that."
Hmm.
And then she came out and said that. But yeah, I remember with the Ahsoka show, she was like, she publicly posted that Hayden Christensen was going to make an appearance in it.
Hmm.
And no one knew that, so she leaked that already. And yeah, this is it again. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Backtracking, truthful or not, do you expect John Bernthal to show up in the MCU as the Punisher in some project, whether it be Daredevil Born Again or his own show?
Yeah, I feel like John Bernthal is one of those guys and one of those actors who just like owns that character.
Yeah.
And I can't really see anyone else in that role, really. Like I'm sure someone would give a great performance, but I mean, you watch John Bernthal as the Punisher in Daredevil and his show, it's like, yep, that's definitely the character. Like I can, like any time he makes an appearance in comics that I read, I'm like, that's John Bernthal right there. So yeah, I could totally see this happening, and with Daredevil returning with the same actor, and I think there's talks about maybe Jessica Jones. I can also see that for John Bernthal, who I liked his show the first season enough. I didn't love it, but I thought his performance was pretty excellent. So would love to see him return.
Yeah, I love him as the character. I never finished season one, but I did like what I saw. Um, a lot of these shows came out when I was in college, and I was just super busy all over the place. So like I am a bit scattered on some of them, but I honestly, I could see him show up as sort of a surprise casting, and maybe a pretty substantial player in something like Thunderbolts.
Yeah, that's a good call. Like he's definitely someone who toes the line where
Hmm.
like he's doing the right thing but he's going about it in probably not the right way,
Hmm.
and that seems to be the Thunderbolts. It seems like Thunderbolts is not necessarily like Suicide Squad in terms of like it's all villains. It seems like it's people who want to do the right thing but are just doing it in such a chaotic way. So that's a
Hmm.
really good call.
Yeah, I'd be very down to see that because I mean, like we've seen him interact with, and I haven't seen everything, so I might be missing out on something, but we've seen him interact with Daredevil before. I'd be down to see him interact with other characters in the MCU to see who he has a problem with, who he like admires. You know, like in the comics, we know Punisher really admires Captain America. I would be interested to see what he thinks of John Walker. You know,
Right.
so yeah, I'm super down to see more of him in the future, whether that be in a show or a film. But
Yeah, me too.
across the multiverse, in the world of Marvel games, we got some unfortunate news this past week. Just yesterday, as a recording, Marvel's Midnight Suns has been delayed into 2023. However, it's going to be releasing before April, so by the end of this current fiscal year. Yesterday, there was a Take Two earnings call where who is it? Strauss Zelnick, I believe, is the CEO of
Yep.
2K or Take Two.
Hmm.
Um, was like, oh yeah, Grand Theft Auto 5, 170 million copies sold. Red Dead 2, 45 million copies sold. And by the way, Midnight Suns is delayed. So,
It's kind of funny. Like I always forget. Like Take Two is just such a wide reach that you
mhm.
kind of forget. Like I did not remember that Midnight Suns was under their umbrella,
Yeah,
so that was weird. But yeah, this is unfortunate. Isn't this the second delay of the game?
I believe so. Because, yeah, it was supposed to come out in the last fiscal year because it was slated to release, I think, February of 2022, which would have
Mm-hmm.
fallen under last year's fiscal, and got pushed into October of this year, which honestly seemed like a good place for it, considering it's like demons and spooky Marvel stuff.
Right.
But yep, we're gonna be getting our hands on it at some point early next year. A lot of back and forth with this one. Like you said, it's been delayed already. Is there something to be worried about? Is this truly just a polish thing, like good old Strauss said on that investors call? Does this worry you at all, Jack, about the game?
No, I mean, I was never the biggest proponent for this. It didn't really seem like it was the game for me. But I mean, if the devs are taking more time to like polish it and make sure it's the best product they can possibly make, then that's all the more better. Definitely interested to try it when it does come out. And honestly, seeing the lineup that we have for the fall, kind of glad it's released out of there to give it some more. I mean, who knows like what games will surround it when it actually releases, but just give it some more room. Like we have Gotham Knights coming out in October, and then like God of War, and then a bunch of other games as well. So yeah, it's honestly probably for the best that it got delayed.
You know, we got before April of next year, we got Resident Evil 4.
Yeah, man, gotta get out of the way of that thing.
Absolutely. But something you said also of like making sure that they have the resources to make the game the best it can be, right? Obviously, I'm a little hesitant based off of my history with strategy games. I love strategy games. I love Marvel, but card systems in games can be like very hit or miss for me. Usually miss. So definitely excited to get my hands on this one and like try it, but uh, that is a worry I've had. But that aside, the fact that they're pushing it again, the fact that they've also delayed indefinitely the last gen versions of this, so like Switch, PS4, and Xbox One, those are on hold indefinitely. Not outright canceled, but a game you brought up, Gotham Knights, was initially supposed to release in 2021, then it got pushed into this year, and then when it was dated, I think back in May or June, um, they announced that they were just canceling the last gen version so they could focus on this one. So, not a wholly one to one scenario, but I could see a world where maybe we don't get that version of the game down the line.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. It seems like that is just a burden at this point for a lot of developers. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, with the pro versions of like the older Xbox consoles as well as like the base versions, and now the current gen consoles, like there's just so many variables for developing these games, and it has to be such a headache that, like what you said with Gotham Knights and WB, they're just like, now we just kind of need to focus on the current gen and PC. Like that, it seems like a lot of devs are doing that at this point. So I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they were just like, yeah, they're no longer indefinitely delayed because they're just canceled.
Yeah, and another element to throw in here is I think when the game got its new date at the Summer Game Fest live show, I believe that's where it was given the date. There was a sort of conversation that happened there as well of like, hey, where's the Switch version? Because that was announced to be coming out with the rest of them back in February at the initial date. Uh, so I wonder, because like now that I realize the Switch version is probably going to be like not well optimized if it ever even comes out compared to the other versions, like just because of the hardware and having to make the sacrifices. Um, I wonder if they had like a projection of how the game would sell on Switch, because again, I love strategy games on my Switch. I would have loved to play it there, but if the pool of people playing on Switch is like enough that it's like, oh, that market could just exist on the Steam Deck with the PC release that's existing. Like, I wonder if that is enough to sort of add fuel to that. Maybe we just hold those off indefinitely, you know?
Yeah, I feel like the Switch one kind of surprises me because that's a large audience, but I feel like third parties on Switch and kind of Nintendo in general are sort of hit or miss.
Yeah.
Like I think Guardians came out as like the cloud version
Mm-hmm.
on Switch, and Apex on there runs like a mess, but that's like kind of expected. Like the Switch is not a powerful machine at all, and the fact that we have like modern games like coming out now in 2023 releasing on like 2017 hardware that really wasn't even very powerful at the time it released. Like I feel like it's difficult for devs to make like a really scaled down version of that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the return on investment might not be too high on that. So I suppose that makes sense.
Yeah. So we will be looking forward to the next release date announced for Midnight Suns. Maybe Game Awards gets a date.
Mm?
Keely's done some Marvel stuff before. I think he's helped this specific game a couple times. So
Ooh, I forgot how bad Game Awards was last year.
I can't even think of a single thing that was there.
There were like some hype things, but it was just like a really messy show. I think for like the opening and the close was really good, like the Wonder Woman stuff, showing off Star Wars Eclipse, the vaporware that it is, and things like that was interesting. And then like the majority of the show was like, what is happening? This is like a giant advertisement.
That's a good point. So fingers crossed, we got another Keely show coming up pretty soon. And as we wind down across the multiverse, I'll shout out this week as of recording, as of release of this episode, Spider-Man Remastered is launching on PC. So
Yeah,
one of the greatest superhero games ever made, one of the best games made in the last few years, I think.
very true. I want to see the mods on that thing.
Yeah, man, it's gonna be sweet. You already know, like, people are gonna dump the all the suits that were in like that Amazing Spider-Man game that has some weird cult following. Those are all gonna be in there day one,
Oh yeah.
easily. But yeah, check it out if you got a PC that can run it. And it seems like most, even like a modest PC can run it well enough from what I looked at. So
Yeah. I bet that game, like on max settings, looks incredible, like with the ray tracing and all that.
oh yeah, yeah. I'm gonna try and convince my brother to get it because he has a very nice PC that like runs Cyberpunk very well and it looks very good on it. So I'm gonna be like, hey, you see that that Spider-Man's only like what, like $50? Wow, look at that.
Maybe you should lend me your PC.
Yeah. So speaking of Spider-Man, last episode we talked about Spider-Man Life Story by Chip Zdarsky. We ran through issues 1 through 3. Today we are going to be finishing out the arc issues 4 through 6. Before we dive into it, I do want to shout out, considering we're talking about Daredevil earlier in this episode. Chip Zdarsky is the writer of pretty much every Daredevil comic from Marvel since 2019, I want to say. That's the only Marvel comic that I try to keep up with because it is so damn good. It's fantastic. So if you're curious, if you want to get into like a actual ongoing Marvel comic, highly, highly, highly recommend Chip Zdarsky's Daredevil. I think it's probably pretty simple to get into. I think most of the initial run is on Marvel Unlimited, and then there was like a little bit of an interlude where Elektra was Daredevil, and then they're just starting up like a second rebooted Daredevil #1, still creative team, still same continuity. So just want to give some props to that because it's so good.
Sweet.
But this Spider-Man story, Jack, you were surprised by it last week, right? The direction it went.
Yeah, I was mainly surprised with the life story was actually sticking with like the same iteration of Peter Parker throughout the decades.
So this week, when we went through the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, were you pleased to see a curmudgeonly old Peter Parker sort of coming to terms with his career as Spider-Man?
I think that's the thing I liked most about the entire run, but specifically these 3 issues is seeing like an older Peter Parker.
Mm-hmm.
That's something we never see. And we get to the 2010s, what, he's like 70, I think.
Yep.
That's something we never see. And I appreciate the story on that aspect alone.
Yeah, definitely. I always thought it was interesting and honestly fully in character. Like, I never really thought about it too long, but yeah, it completely makes sense that Peter Parker would feel so much guilt and like be unable to take off the mask until he's like dead, right?
Right.
It's sort of a conversation that I think we don't really have very often. Like we love having that talk about Batman, right? We love like when is Batman gonna hang it up? When's he gonna pass it on? But with Spider-Man, it seems like he's perpetually 30 at max, right?
Yeah. That's
So
like old man Spider-Man is 30.
yeah, for sure. Um, so yeah, seeing them explore that here, I did really like, and we can get to the 2010s. I'm sure we will have some more things to say about how the story wraps up. But picking up where we left off with the 90s, what did you think?
Um, I I feel like these later issues I have more issues with
Mm-hmm.
than the first few.
Okay.
Um, with the 90s, he's now as like he has Parker Industries now, like he's doing like a competitor to like Reed Richards,
Mm-hmm.
it seems, as well as like Stark Industries, um, which is all well and good. I really dislike the clone bits in this, and dealing. I thought it was really silly for them to be like, "Oh, Peter's like this is like from the Clone Saga from the 90s, I think. Like, oh, Peter is actually the clone, and Ben was the real Peter all along." And then like going back at the end and being like, "Oh, it was that Peter was actually the real Peter, and we were just doing that to mess with you." I was like, that's kind of silly. Like, I know this series is trying to like touch on the major points
Mm-hmm.
of like what was popular with Spider-Man in those decades from like sort of a meta perspective. Um, but I think a lot of people mentioned that Clone Saga was bad. So I feel like that was definitely a choice to include that in this. And I ended up like I've never read the Clone Saga, but I feel like once you get into like the really comic booky types of telling stories with things like that, it gets really silly, and I don't love that. Like in Spider-Man Blue, I feel like there's some silliness, but like it's pretty grounded for the most part in terms of telling a Spider-Man story, and that's sort of my comparison to this, where this definitely gets wacky in a lot of instances, and I'm not really there for it.
Yeah, I think that's fair, right? Because I think if you set out as a creative team to say, hey, we want to tell like an actual, like congruous, complete Spider-Man story, like what would it be like if Peter Parker lived through and aged through all of these events rather than like being Bart Simpson and never aging? Um, I think you have to realize what you're getting into with that, right? And like you, I haven't read the Clone Saga. I haven't read any of that stuff. I've just heard the reputation around it. And I think where, and we talked about this last week, where Spider Man Blue is able to tell more of a story that's like super personal and about Peter and his thoughts and emotions as a character. Um, Spider Man Life Story is more so not necessarily acting as a greatest hits, but like trying to put him into perspective of what it would be like if a real person was Spider Man. Um, and I think when we get into the clone stuff, it's like that is the comic bookness of it, you know, where I feel like it's hard to separate certain characters from the most extreme, wild, wacky things that come from their history, right? Like, I think there's no way to tell a Batman life story by comparison without touching on, like, I don't know, like Joker throwing a pie in somebody's face as like his actual plan, not necessarily a pie bomb, but you also have to cover like the death of Jason Todd, you know? Because both of those elements were super important to the foundations of a character. So, yeah, I think honestly, having this experience with the clone storytelling, you probably never need to read anything about the Clone Saga because this is
No.
probably the best way it can be handled, I would imagine. The most
Yeah.
succinct way you can write and have a meaningful impact with that component of this character.
I think the only clones I've liked in any media were the clone troopers in Star Wars.
Really?
But like it doesn't even work for other clones in Star Wars, like Snoke and like the Emperor, kind of like it's like, what are you doing? And
Star
now with
Killer,
all Star Killer, as in like the
Sam
expanded.
Witwer.
Yeah, I never played the Force Awakens, unfortunately.
Wait, really?
No, never did. Yeah,
First one I loved. I never played the second one, but the second one is when they get into the clone business. So
yeah. Is Rey a clone? I'm kind of forgetting that now.
she's the daughter of a
Oh,
clone.
okay, okay. Oh yeah. Wait, really?
Yes, her dad was a deformed Palpatine clone.
Oh my god. Man, I guess I never really like explicitly explained that in the movie.
Nah, that's all the
That was
books.
yeah. God. Yeah. So again, I think clones are really silly in media, and that rarely are they effective. Um, I think though, like my biggest issue, I think, with this series in general, or like the arc in general, is it hits on a lot of points like from like a very high level, and
Hmm.
it's kind of surface level. And I wish it was slightly longer. Like I wish we spent a little bit more time in the decades going over like maybe like a 3 act structure in the 60s and a 3 act in the 70s and so on.
Hmm.
Just so it like feels a little bit like, obviously we're going through the life of Peter Parker. I feel like 6 issues is a little, it's not enough to really cover that whole life experience. And it kind of reminds me of like Invincible in a lot of ways, and like not spoiling it, but like Invincible covers Mark Grayson's like growing up, and like spends a significant amount of time throughout his life, not just like in his like early teenage years. And I mean that has 144 issues, and I mean that would certainly be way too many for like a like graphic novel run. But like, I don't know, maybe I feel like having 2 or 3 issues in a decade would definitely go a long way to make it feel a little bit more fleshed out.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and I think going into this expecting just based off the title, right? Just to get a full comprehensive look at Peter Parker and like where he was at. How many pages was each issue of this? Was it wasn't like an extended issue of a comic, right? It was like relatively standard for comic stuff. Like it ranged around like 30 pages, right, per issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the page count. It felt pretty standard.
Yeah. So even like if they bumped it up an extra 20 pages per issue, I could see maybe that sort of solving some of the hangups that you're talking about with it so far. But yeah, I think the clone stuff is definitely an interesting point of Spider-Man's life and career and existence as a character, that it's it's a catalyst for like a bunch of other elements of this 6 issue arc that I think are much more interesting than the clone stuff. But from since it was introduced in issue 2, I think in this arc, um, it does not go away. Even if it's just like, hey, yeah, this thing happened to this clone character, which caused this other event that is the thing we're diving into and talking about. So, on that level, was that taking you out of the experience? Like the fact that in the 2000s issue, like Peter's identity is revealed the same way it is in the actual Civil War comic, except the method of it is by the Ben Riley Peter clone acting as Peter Parker being unmasked. Like it's working into make sense with this take on Peter Parker they're establishing, but for people who might not be down with the clones, it's like, oh, you made the clone an important thing again. Like, how did that land for you?
I think the one thing about the clone uh, business in this series is I did like at the end of the 90s Peter being like not like giving away to Ben that he knew,
Mm-hmm.
and he was like, all right, you're Peter, like go do your thing. So he lets Ben like kind of take over as Peter, and then he goes to live off with MJ and his family. I did enjoy that. Um, so I kind of appreciated that aspect of this. So that in the 2000s part, I didn't mind.
Yeah, and I thought it was clever, right? Because again, I'm rereading this and I knew how heavy the clone stuff was involved. But even on my first read, like understanding that they were going to continue with having the clone element of Spider-Man and Peter at play with this take on the character and this like storyline of his life, I thought it was a neat way to still get that huge, massive megaton moment in the actual 616 comic story of Civil War, where it's like Peter unmasks and it's a big deal and has ramifications. And in this storyline for this universe of Peter, he's still unmasked, but it's Ben, and then that has to get Peter Prime to like get back into the game, and I think that's an interesting way to continue on that the story. Well, similar to the stuff with like Craven's Last Hunt, how that was sort of integrated into the 80s issue, not being fully authentic, but still having like a key moment or two. I liked that. I thought that was a cool way to do it.
I'll say I think the 2000s issue may be my favorite of the sixth,
Okay.
because I love Civil War in general, and I like this book's take on the Peter Tony relationship, where I'm so used to them being like father and son, pretty much. And in this, they are very much like competitors and rivals in a sense. And Peter sides with Captain America in this, which is different than the comics. Or maybe eventually he goes to the Cap side, but initially he's with Iron Man. And in this, he's always been Team Cap. And I like that. I like that in this. It's definitely a change from what we know.
Yeah, and I do think it's fun, right? I do like that in a lot of comic stories. Like, granted, I haven't read any Iron Man comics, but every time Iron Man shows up, I'm like, this dude fucking sucks. He is a villain in a hero's armor.
Right.
And I do like that continues here, because I do enjoy seeing that Peter, sort of working class hero guy, being able to be in the same room as the 1% dude, and like on the hero persona have as much if not more respect thrown his way, and sort of carrying that as Peter Parker. What does that do for him in negotiations and stuff like that, like mentally, and if he gets talked down to, stuff like that. I really, really like seeing that play out. I also love that Iron Man is in charge of the U.S. Avengers, the USA. Like that,
Right.
that just gave me U.S. agent stuff and John Walker again. Like, what a is it like a dystopia if it feels like that's sort of like real? I
Right.
don't know.
Yeah. I I always like Tony Stark, and I think you're right. Like even in the comics, he seems a little more um, antagonistic in a way, and like harder to side with. But there's always like something about him where it's like he's kind of right. Like, and he was mentioning like he didn't say like put a suit of armor around the world, but he was like alluding to that fact,
Yeah,
and it just made me think of like Thanos and all that. It's like there's a point where like something could happen, and the work he's doing could prevent that. But yeah, the way they're going about it obviously is not the best. But there's something to that, and I've always appreciated that about the character.
for sure. And I think like obviously in the MCU he's way more likable, and I enjoy
Yeah,
him as a character from the Robert Downey Jr. take. Um, but yeah, letting being able to see him in the comics really like sort of stew with the more flaw heavy elements of Tony Stark I really like. So seeing that again here in this abridged sort of retelling of Civil War was fun. Um, and then we get into the 2010s, which deals with the fallout of the Civil War. We do a pretty major time skip. Like you said, Peter is in his 70s now. I think they specifically call out 72. So he's up there. He is an aged man, elderly, you would say, depending on who you
yes,
ask.
yes.
So could have called this
Wearing
one
that like
Spider-Man senior year.
that's right. Yeah, he's wearing some sort of suit that you have to imagine. Obviously, like they're going into space, but some sort of suit that's probably like holding him up a little bit.
Oh, definitely, right? Like I think which one is it? There was a the Amazing Spider-Man run that Marvel had the same guy on for like 10 years, Dan Slott. That's when like Parker Industries really kicked off as being like this core element to him, and it's pretty divisive. Like some people really don't like the direction that they took with him for that long. Um, One of my favorite suits from Insomniac's Spider-Man that you can unlock, I think, is the Mark IV, which is like it looks like a normal Spider-Man suit, but the red is definitely armored, and then there's like this sort of like green glowing from the eyes and around the spider chest, like very faintly outlined. That was from that run. So that was more technologically advanced. That was more of like the armored suit from the video games or the Iron Spider in the MCU. So I would imagine that at this point in time, like Parker Industries being around for a long time, then for sure you're right. That is holding together some weaker parts of Peter Parker the man.
Yeah, definitely.
So, but you'd also have to think like, and I think this is another thing where we talked earlier how like we love having this conversation about Batman in his old age. Since Peter Parker is an enhanced superhuman, what affordances does that give him as he ages, you know? So,
Yeah.
they don't really touch on that in this, but
No, yeah. It's pretty surface level. And that's part of my issues with this. And like I think one of the first few panels we see is like Miles comes out, his daughter comes out in a suit, and it's like, oh man, I kind of wish we had like spent a little bit more time with them. And I know we're kind of this is supposed to just be like flashes to like the most important points throughout the decades, but part of me wishes we got like a little bit of an extended look into his life throughout, because Spider-Man's really important. I feel like you gotta take the time to flesh that out. But I understand the point of the book is to be more high level and just sort of show like the most important parts.
yeah, because I think also something to consider is like for men, not all, but for many of these elements, they do have that in Spider-Man runs throughout history, right? Like they have the ability to introduce Miles slowly and build up that mentorship and really flesh that out. And he does have children at one point. I forget when that happened. I think it was before One More Day or whatever that was.
Yeah.
Like that is an element of I think the story that they're maybe banking on you knowing more about the character than what they're doing here, because you're right. Like in the 2010s issue, when Miles is introduced, there's not much development you get actively about their relationship together as mentor and apprentice, right?
Yeah, he's just kind of there. And you, as the reader, you kind of have to fill in the blanks
Yeah,
throughout this book.
yeah. So it is tricky, right? Because the story they're telling throughout all 6 issues is not a Spider-Man story that exists outside of this book, but the elements that all come together to make it a story are elements that have existed throughout time. So it's like it's definitely hard to land on like what I think you're right. The easiest solution would probably be to have more issues, but again, I don't know why they landed on 6. I don't know if that was a Marvel decision, a creative decision, or what, but
Yeah,
the 2010s gets pretty wacky.
it does. That's probably my least favorite because
Really?
of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Doc Ock takes over Miles. I don't like that.
Yeah, so are you familiar with the Superior Spider-Man at all?
No.
So the Superior Spider-Man, I haven't read it. I know there are people who think it's like one of the best arcs and runs of Spider-Man ever. For a period of time, Otto Octavius took over Peter Parker's body and acted as Spider-Man. And that was during that 10 years of Amazing Spider-Man under Dan Slott.
That sounds awful. I'm sure it could have been very good, but like the premise of that sounds horrible.
People love it, Jack. They think it's incredible.
I'd have to read that, but like the log line you just gave me, no thanks.
Yeah, so it might have been a separate. I don't know how it worked, but I know Superior Spider-Man was praised for a long time. I don't know if Dan Slott actually wrote it. But yeah, it does have a huge, huge following and a huge fan base. So it was Dan Slott. But the only thing that I ever heard about that was, God, I forget who got put on Spider-Man after he was done, but I read the beginning of that because that was a new number one. And something that I thought was fun was to drag Peter Parker back down to the Peter everybody loves. The new creative team was like, oh, so Peter graduated Empire State University when he was controlled by Otto Octavius. So some AI system after he graduated figured out, like, it's like, oh, the writing of Peter's dissertation was just, this is Otto Octavius's writing. So you plagiarized it, so we're taking your degree away. So like there were ramifications for it, but yeah, it's definitely a hard pitch to accept, I think.
Yeah, I might have to look into that because I have just so many questions about that. But
Yeah. That's all the specifics I know, but people really
yeah,
like it.
in the context of this, I didn't love the Miles takeover. Like again, once we get into like the really gimmicky territory of comics, that really turns me off.
Yeah. I think it's also with Spider-Man who in like the mainstream takes on Spider-Man, it's so distant from a lot of these things, right? Where for the most part, like with all the movies, the game, even from like stuff from shows I've seen, Spider-Man never really gets like over the top ridiculous when it comes to logic. Like you get the Raimi camp, you get Amazing Spider-Man 2 with three casts worth of characters, but you don't really get surprise. Tom Holland's Spider-Man was actually controlled by Deadpool with a remote the whole time, right? Like that's
Yeah.
nothing like that.
No, yeah. So that like when it does come up and stuff like this, I'm like, ooh, that seems off.
Shark
And
has
like I know it
jumped.
exists, of course, in comics, but it's just like, ah, man.
So, were there any elements of the post-apocalypse Doom controlled world that you enjoyed?
I was slightly confused. So like like after Civil War had like sort of divided the Avengers, Doom stepped up and like basically took over the world. Is that what happened?
Yeah, so I think there was like some deal with the devil somewhere, and then Doom was like, "This is my chance," and then he took over basically because sort of look at like the Zemo plan, but if Zemo wanted to step in and be like, "I can offer services to protect the world," like that's similar, I guess.
Yeah, I'll say we don't really see much of it. It's mostly Peter and Miles
Mm-hmm.
in space, like trying to stop whatever's happening, and it's mostly like an internal thing with Peter,
Mm-hmm.
kind of fighting villains in his imagination. It seems.
Yeah, which I'm glad it's more focused on like the internal of the spaceship, but more literally his mind as opposed to like really diving in with what's going on Earth. Because for a finale, for basically killing off Peter Parker, keeping it more personal despite how it's executed, I think is the right call.
Right.
But I did get Arkham vibes when Doc Ock was messing with his mind and his visions, with like the giant scarecrow and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a really good call.
So I did like that element, and I guess like it was kind of cheesy, but the way it wrapped up and like him having closure with everything, I thought was like a fitting way to kill off Peter Parker. If you're gonna kill him off, I feel like you have to do it with some level of weird meta stuff, right? Because he's such a beloved character, you can't just unceremoniously do it, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, what did you think about his death?
I was a little torn on it. I always like Peter in like the friendly neighborhood aspect, so like him going to space is always like a little strange to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't love that, but I guess him like sacrificing himself, like that seems like that's always going to be the Spider-Man way of like him going out. So they got that.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts on Life Story?
I'd say overall I appreciated the attempt of like telling that like one continuous story. and I liked it overall, but I think there were just some issues that I have that it's like, oh, this is really comic booky and at points a little silly that I didn't love, but I think there aren't too many examples, I think, of stories about like beloved comic book characters that just follow their entire lives. And like so many times it's like rebooted and things like that. So I think this is a really good attempt of like having one like sort of concrete example of looking at a character's entire life. And I appreciate it on that level.
If you could see the same creative team that worked on the entirety of Life Story be granted like, I don't know, 30 issues to do the same sort of thing. Like if this was a proof of concept with the same team, same writer, um, same artist, like all the same people calling the shots on this, but being granted sort of a lot more room to tell the story of Peter Parker, do you think you'd be interested in that, or would you rather see another person take another stab at sort of the same scope of a story?
Yeah, I think I would like the increased scope, and I would say not to be so like um not necessarily to focus on the things you'd be expected to focus on. Like I think the Clone Saga and the influence in this comic book like definitely really influenced this run in a way that I thought was became a negative to a point. So like if they just did this and had like a much longer run and just told their own Spider-Man story, like yeah, maybe you have allusions to things that happen in the comics, but just tell your own story of what you think would happen with Peter like throughout his life. That sounds very appealing to me. But I do think like some of the allusions to some of the comics we get along the way that we've gotten along the way kind of hinders this at some points.
Yeah, I enjoy the comic. I like I said, it's not my favorite Spider-Man graphic novel sort of collection. It's definitely up there, just off the concept alone, and I do like most of the issues. But I would agree with you. I would love to see this team be given reign to sort of really go off, and similar to I guess what Marvel Zombies is doing as a spinoff of What If, right? Where it was like, oh, that was really cool. Just really double down on that, you know. Um, I would like that because you're right. We really don't get the chance to see characters have arcs like that. Um, I think honestly, outside like even thinking beyond just superheroes, like I don't think there's really many stories in media that are like fictional that follow a character through their entire lives. The only one that I can think of right now is the Ezio games from Assassin's Creed. Like
Yeah.
you see him as like a 17-year-old and you see him midlife and on his death, right? Like you see his entire life. And even in the MCU, it's like all these dudes are like late 30s when we meet them for the most part. And they either die in their late 30s also or are still existing, right? So I think the remember there was that rumor that we'd get a Spider-Man 3 trilogies.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like that I think would be great because you get something similar to what we're talking about here with Tom Holland, but logistically, I don't know if we'll ever get that. So if we can get it through a comic, I'd be down for it.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That is Spider-Man Life Story in full. A life story covered in probably an hour's worth of podcast conversation.
Yep.
Like I said, we will be back for She-Hulk next episode, but until then, Jack, where can the agents of Excelsior find you?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Fascinated Jack. What about you?
You can find me on Twitter and TikTok at Shun2D2. You can find the show on Twitter at ExcelsiorJC. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just look up Excelsior, Joy Clicks, or Marvel's Avengers podcast. You'll find it. Rating and reviewing is a free way to help the show if you enjoy it. Helps us reach more people. Helps us keep going. We appreciate it. Takes a quick second to write a blurb or hit 5 stars. And if you want to support us further, you can do so by going to patreon.com/joyclicks. You can at the $1 and $5 tiers support. The $5 tier, you will get producer credit for every show we produce, like Aaron Easton and Jose Garcia. So thank you so much, and that will do it for Excelsior. Once again, no episode next week, but we look forward to seeing some new MCU stuff with She-Hulk and getting in the weeds when we return. But until then, Excelsior.
Excelsior.